time, and we're very grateful for your presence and really look forward to today's event. My name is Barbara Savage. I'm a professor in the History Department of the University of Pennsylvania and one of the co-directors of the Black Women's Intellectual History Collective, which we call, although it doesn't really fit the acronym, we call BEWITCHED, as in bewitched, bothered, and bewildered. I think that's how we came to that as we were thinking about the status of a field like Black women's intellectual history and what it might look like and what it might become. And this conference is part of that process, and I think one that we've been looking forward to for years now, and so we're very grateful for your presence here with us, and very appreciative of all the people who've helped make this possible. And we certainly want to give a special thanks to Columbia University for hosting this particular event and doing it so well, with particular appreciation to the Center for the Critical Analysis of Social Difference here at Columbia, and especially to the Institute for Research in African American Studies and our colleagues and friends there who really have done the logistical work of getting all of us in this room together. So a special thanks to them, and also to our colleague Farrah Griffin, who is too modest to claim credit for anything, but who of course deserves a great deal of credit for this event and for the way in which it's being run. So for those of you who were not able to be here yesterday, we got off to a rousing good start and had two really great panels with a lot of very interesting questions and answers, and really deep and fun conversations, which is what we had envisioned and what we had hoped. And certainly none of that would have been possible without the participation from, as we say in the church, from people in the pews. So we certainly hope that there will continue to be a great deal of audience participation. And so unless there's something else that I should announce, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. And a number of brave people who walked over from the hotel in 6-inch heels are making their way here. And we will then have a larger audience and some blistered feet, but they'll be here. So thank you very much. I should introduce my colleague, Natanya Duncan, who is going to moderate this panel for us with her usual excellence and dispatch, I'm sure. And she has been a steadfast and very important member of our collective and a part of the working group over the last 3 or 4 years, and has done really, and continues to do really great work on the role of women in the Garvey movement. And as someone who speaks very passionately about that and has brought a great deal of vitality and verve to our group, so we're very grateful that she has agreed to moderate the panel. Okay, all right.
Good morning. What Dr. Savage really means is that, I just like to tell dry jokes, mainly, and so, that's my role. I also like to thank you very much for being here, and am grateful to Columbia University for housing us. Just a few housekeeping notes. Dr. Sharon Harley was unable to be with us today due to the inclement weather on yesterday and flight cancellations. Also, we are eagerly anticipating the third panelist, which is Dr. Gebhard. She is en route at the moment. She and her luggage had a disagreement, and the luggage went one way and she went the other. We're trying to get them reunited so that she can get here. See, I told you that's my job. Now, on the panel this morning, we are very, very fortunate to have Meredith Clark-Wiltz, who will, and I'm saying will, successfully defend her dissertation, Revising Constitutions, Race and Discrimination in Jury Service, 1868 to 1979, on May 5th. Please congratulate her afterwards. She has recently accepted a tenure-track position as Assistant Professor of History at Franklin College, and has a forthcoming article Persecuting Black Men and Gendering Jury Service, the NAACP Cases of the 1930s, in an edited volume, in Interconnections, that will be published in the Gender and Race American History Series at the University of Rochester Press later this year. Ms. Wentz has also been working on not only women in jury service, but also Black men in jury service, and has spent some time researching the likes of Pauli Murray, and is someone who I feel is rather well-versed in this area, so I'm looking forward to her paper. Second on our panel is Dr. Julie Gallagher, who's an assistant professor of history at Penn State University, the Brandywine campus in media. She has just completed a book entitled Black Women and Politics in New York City, which is forthcoming from University of Illinois Press. She also recently published The National Council of Negro Women, Human Rights and the Cold War in a new anthology on women's post-World War II activism. And that anthology is entitled Breaking the Wave, Women, Their Organization and Feminisms, 1945 to 1985, and is on Routledge Press. In addition to her stellar scholarship, Professor Gallagher is also an active legislative coordinator for Pennsylvania and Ohio's Amnesty International. And she really has spent a lot of time considering all sides of this, and so we're really looking forward to her paper. Lastly, we will have Dr. Gebhard as soon as she gets here, and she is a professor of English at Tuskegee University, and she joined the faculty of Tuskegee in 1994. She co-edited most recently with Barbara McCaskill, Postbellum Pre-Harlem, African American Literature and Culture, 1877 to 1919. She is also now presently at work on another co-edited book, Invisible Legacy, The Women of Tuskegee, 1881 to 1981, which is about women at the institution during its first 100 years. For the purpose of today's panel, we will have the first paper by Meredith, Recognizing Jane Crow, Pauli Murray, the Doubly Victimized and the Race-Sex Analogies in Jury Service Policies of the 1960s and 70s. We will then have Julie, Mobilizing for Justice, A History of Black Women in the State. And then we will have Professor Caroline Jessie Parkhurst Guzman, Tuskegee's Forgotten Scholar Activist for Civic Democracy. Because we are missing one panelist, we will allow 15 minutes for presentation, and then we will have comments from one of our grand dames, Dr. Savage. Please. And she will also take 15 minutes for her comments, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A. I thank you. I was stretching because I'm trying to get Dr. Gebhard here. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Natanya.
Well, thank you for the wonderful introduction, perhaps not quite deserved, but we'll see on May 5th. And I will play this. I will play this for my defense committee in case they were wavering. I am so happy to be here, and I am honored to be on this panel, and I anticipate wonderful questions, and so I'm looking forward, and we'll try not to race through to get there. My paper is Recognizing Jane Crow, and it's part of an article project that I'm working on that's coming out of my dissertation, and so I'm interested in seeing how I could develop it more. Now, how do I go about killing Jane Crow? Prejudice against sex. Pauli Murray asked prominent civil rights lawyer and her mentor, Leon A. Ransom, in 1944, posing this question, Murray highlighted the pervasiveness of sex discrimination, comparing it to the experience of racial segregation, and implicitly emphasizing the doubly burdened position of black women specifically. The use of Jane Crow placed black women's experiences at the crux of the analogy. Murray originated and refined this race-sex analogy that informed the social activism, anti-discrimination policies, and feminist thought of the 1960s. Pauli Murray was a lawyer, a civil rights activist, and a founding feminist. One of Murray's greatest contributions to the social activism of the 1960s was the analogy she drew between race and sex, which forged an important new feminist legal strategy premised on the 14th Amendment. This paper examines how Murray's analysis of the relationship between race and sex evolved, beginning with her cursory recognition of the existence of Jane Crow to her more sophisticated analysis of women's need for jury service and the ERA, or Equal Rights Amendment. And I argue that black feminist legal thought was central to the adoption of anti-discrimination policies, perhaps most notably jury service reform, as well as to the emergence of the feminist movement. The significant role that Pauli Murray played in these campaigns demonstrates that the feminist movement of the 1960s and 1970s did not simply follow the civil rights movement, but was inextricably connected to it through individuals, organizations, and policy. This condensed version of my paper will address three particular aspects of Murray's thought concerning the use of race-sex analogies to achieve social justice. First, it will briefly discuss her growing awareness of sex discrimination in the context of civil rights activism. Second, it will explore her commitment to jury service reform and the use of a 14th Amendment litigation strategy while working on behalf of the President's Commission on the Status of Women and the ACLU in the 1960s. And finally, it will consider Murray's emerging support for the ERA by the 1970s. Murray recognized the interplay between race and sex during her experiences as a student in the 1940s. She began comparing sex discrimination with race discrimination in her own experiences at Howard Law School. The limited perspectives of some of the civil rights leaders, like Ransom, whom Murray said she deeply admired, contributed to her awareness of sexism within progressive activist circles. She was bewildered that men who faced racism discriminated against women on the basis of sex, and she rooted her feminist awakening in the exclusionary measures practiced by male lawyers at Howard. She had entered Howard to become a civil rights attorney, but Murray realized that she had graduated, quote, an unabashed feminist as well, end quote. Murray's contribution to the feminist legal thought emerged most outstandingly during her tenure on the President's Commission on the Status of Women in the early 1960s. Murray substantially shaped the legal strategy it adopted. Opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment, she proposed that the Commission challenge discriminatory laws by expanding the interpretation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause to include protection against sex discrimination. Murray's goal with this approach was to achieve legal recognition of the diversity of women's roles and capabilities. She, quote, was eager to explore a constitutional alternative, end quote, to the ERA, one that the Commission selected her to craft because of her knowledge of civil rights cases. Her 1962 Memorandum on the Applicability of the 14th Amendment to State Statutes and Administration of Executive Practices was distinguished on the basis of sex. She had long titles like I do. Provided the basis for the Commission's adopted strategy and refocused women's rights around the same arguments used by civil rights activists. Murray formulated a new legal approach that drew out analogies between race and sex through its use of the 14th Amendment. And in making her case, she drew parallels between the quest for racial equality and women's fight for citizenship, underlining the time lag and the sequence between the two struggles. She emphasized that, quote, litigation involving the rights of women as fully participating citizens in the United States is almost half a century and certainly a quarter century behind the litigation seeking established equal rights for Negroes and other minorities, end quote. Murray believed that with these efforts and a careful selection of test cases, women's rights advocates could present a solid case for women's jury service rights and, more importantly, an expansive reading of the 14th Amendment. By the mid-1960s, Murray would join the American Civil Liberties Union to test this legal strategy. The ACLU supported Murray's analogical reasoning and sought a litigation strategy to test its applicability to jury service obligations. Murray joined white lawyer and experienced women's rights advocate Dorothy Kenyon and other ACLU members in arguing on behalf of a group of black men and women in Alabama in 1965. The plaintiffs claimed that the exclusion of both African Americans and women from juries in the county violated their constitutional rights. The resulting case, White v. Crook, would become the first case to successfully merge 14th Amendment equal protection arguments against race discrimination with those against sex discrimination. Murray and Kenyon emphasized the argument about exclusion of women from juries violating the 14th Amendment and pressed for a more complicated investigation of the relationship between race and sex discrimination in order to unravel the notion of privilege that stymied white women's rights, historically vilified black men, and usually ignored black women altogether. As a reflection of their efforts, the White Brief also explored the relationship between the, quote, Negro Revolution, end quote, and the American woman, focusing on the convergence of racial and gender stereotypes that reinforced one another. The landmark federal court decision in White that offered an expanded interpretation of the 14th Amendment and the anticipated Supreme Court review of it gave many women new hope for equal citizenship. Murray had speculated prior to the decision that 1966 might be, quote, the year of women, end quote. She believed that the decision in White v. Crook to be historic. Unfortunately, the state refrained from appealing the decision to the Supreme Court, blunting the effect of this strategy. She explained that the ACLU's simultaneous support for the 1966 federal legislation that would equalize women's obligations to serve on juries reflected a real achievement for women seeking full civic membership. With the urging of President Lyndon B. Johnson, Congress considered jury service reform in the mid-1960s, right alongside this case, White v. Crook. And in these legislative negotiations, Polly Murray played a decisive, though more discreet role that allowed her to draw parallels between race and sex discrimination in order to secure benefits for women. The ACLU recommended the expansion of the scope of the policy that LBJ had announced to prohibit sex discrimination that excluded women from juries. The proposed addition became known as the Murray Amendment and was adopted by the ACLU unanimously. Others, however, were much less receptive to the addition of women's rights, and that included Senator Paul Douglas, who introduced the jury reform legislation to the Senate without adding protection against sex discrimination in state courts. The ACLU lobbied for the inclusion of women in this legislation, arguing that women's participation was crucial to the struggle to achieve racial equality. It stressed the position of black women in making its case for eliminating sex discrimination. Quote, both halves of the Negro adult population, male and female, must be assured this right if justice is to be meaningful. The inclusion of sex as well as race will ensure that twice as many Negroes are available to serve on juries and protected in that right if would be the case if sex is omitted, end quote. Therefore, the ACLU addressed sex discrimination in jury service by integrating its discussion with arguments against race discrimination and by highlighting rather than ignoring the plight of black women. On behalf of the ACLU, Murray and Kenyon released a report entitled The Case for Equality in State Jury Service on May 1st, 1966. They argued that the Constitution required juries to represent a fair cross-section of citizens and that the exclusion of women violated those principles. Women's inclusion on juries, they contended, especially in the South, was a democratizing and civilizing influence and would help to maintain, quote, law and order consistent with the protection of individual constitutional rights, end quote. Women's participation protected the rights of blacks and created a more just and democratic system. Race-sex analogies underpinned Murray and Kenyon's analysis, though they recognized the obstacle that conceptions of female privilege posed to their comparisons. They analyzed some of the ways in which the understandings of race and sex work together to exclude blacks and women from the political system. The brief explained that though privilege and exemption, quote, paternalism or white male supremacy was rationalized as chivalry and concern for the ladies, end quote. The objective of the ACLU was to improve and define women's citizenship and constitutional status, as well as to, quote, raise the standard of jury service from an onerous duty or a device to maintain white male control into a right and obligation freely enjoyed, conscientiously fulfilled by all citizens, otherwise qualified without discrimination. In 1970, after years of promoting a legal strategy centered on the 14th Amendment, Murray changed her mind about the Equal Rights Amendment. She claimed that the black women have, quote, the most to gain, end quote, from the adoption of the ERA. She confirmed that race-sex analogies must be viewed with careful attention to the overlapping nature of these categories for black women. Ultimately, Murray believed that the ERA, quote, strikes a blow at the powerlessness which all women share, but which Negro women experience in intensified form. Murray also clarified her meaning of the phrase Jane Crow, centering on the experiences of black women even more forcefully. She explained that it, quote, refers to an entire range of assumptions that have robbed women of a positive self-concept and prevented them from participating fully in society as equals with men, end quote. Murray argued that the history of black women remained mostly hidden, and she contended that the common bond of womanhood was not enough to make alliances between white and black women easy. In light of these multiple disadvantages, Murray argued that, quote, that black women can neither postpone nor subordinate the fight against sex discrimination to the Black Revolution, end quote. She stressed the black women's importance to the feminist movement and civil rights struggle, noting that they are key figures in the juncture of these movements. Polly Murray certainly heeded her own advice. She played a major role in shaping the feminist movement, and she pressed for civil rights activism to recognize the plight of black women rather than compound it. In both of these efforts, she employed race-sex analogies to advocate for black women's rights and continuously highlight the necessity of addressing the interlocking nature of categories of identity. Murray held fast to the usefulness of race-sex analogies despite the kind of long-pressed struggle she had in actually getting federal government policy to change. And Jane Crow, the concept she first outlined in the 1940s, remained an integral part of her feminist philosophy and perspective on civil rights. Thank you.
Sign of my age that I have to switch classes at this point from seeing you to seeing the paper. As Meredith said, and many of the other panelists, I'd like to thank the organizers for being able to participate in this panel. I'm a native New Yorker, and it's nice to always be able to come back to the city. And this project is actually deeply tied to my roots here. And though the connection may seem a bit tenuous when you listen to the paper, it started, its roots were when I was teaching high school in New York City in the public school system, and really thinking about racialized gender and power and how do people fight for change and for better conditions for their children, for themselves, in a system that's not particularly hospitable. So this is as I began to look at women in politics, I was immediately drawn to the most famous New York politician, Shirley Chisholm, and that's where I started. In fact, that's where the book ends, because there's a far richer history that I learned over many, many years. And so this is just a very brief snapshot of some of the stories that I uncovered. So, in 1968, Shirley Chisholm, a native of Brooklyn, New York, became the first black woman elected to the United States Congress. 4 years later, she was the first to run for president on a national party ticket. She was justifiably recognized as a political trailblazer, yet her designation as a first tends to obscure the efforts of generations of politically active black women who came before her. Today, I'll outline a few brief examples of the rich history of black women's political activism in New York City throughout the 20th century, and in the process illuminate the broad vision of politics they developed, which included their strategic engagement with the various arms of the state, especially the legislative branch of government. Through their efforts, I argue, African American women in New York City influenced the Democratic Party and policymaking, including by the 1960s at the national level, and they forged a path for subsequent generations of women to follow on. To begin, African American women actively engaged in the battle for women's right to vote from the mid-19th century through the time of its passage, despite pervasive examples of racism in suffrage organizations, which included not only the exclusion of black women from suffrage meetings, but in the southern states, an effort to exclude them from the right to vote itself. The political culture they sought access to was both racialized as white and deeply masculine. This was particularly true in New York City, home of the infamous Democratic Party political machine, Tammany Hall. Undeterred by the obstacles they faced, newly enfranchised African American women in New York began to learn the political ropes because they now had a tool that their Southern sisters in the Jim Crow South did not, and they were determined to use it. They debated how and when to participate in formal politics. They also endeavored to cultivate strategies that would not only land them inside party clubhouses, but also give them a say in the evolving political agendas. The challenges were numerous, and access to political parties and halls of government, they quickly learned, did not equal power. For 15 years after they won the right to vote, women made very little headway in electoral politics. 2 white women from New York City served in the New York State Legislature between 1919 and 1934. Neither the Democrats nor Republicans fielded a black female candidate in that long stretch of time, although I will parenthetically say the Socialist Party did in 1919. By the early 1930s, small stress signs began to appear in the walls of resistance to women in electoral politics, particularly because of African American women's effective community activism and the increase of women on voter registration rolls. A number of black women ran for elected office in Harlem during the 1930s, and I'll just focus on one. Lael Lane was born in Georgia in 1893 and moved north to New Jersey with her parents while still in school. A teacher by profession, she was a civil rights activist who later served on the executive board on the 1941 March on Washington movement, a labor leader who worked with the Southern tenant farmers and served as a vice president of the American Federation of Teachers, and a socialist who believed deeply in the centrality of the state to the alleviation of poverty and racial discrimination. She determined that grassroots efforts alone were insufficient to address the racist problems African Americans in Harlem faced with housing, in jobs, and in education, so she turned her sights to electoral politics. In her 1934 campaign for the U.S. Congress, Lane was explicit about the need for government to aggressively step in to address injustices. Quote, "I believe housing and slum clearance are major obligations of government and should be provided for adequately," she wrote. She also favored state planning and argued that state aid was necessary to eliminate inequality in education for both rural and urban children. As with many other leftists, she favored price controls and government-supported full employment programs. She lost her 1934 campaign, just as she lost the subsequent 8 efforts that carried on through 1947 that she made to win elected office in New York City. Her socialist platform that situated the government at the center of solutions to housing, employment, and labor problems did not appeal to the masses. Yet, despite Lane's losses, her campaigns did something important, I argue. She helped voters acclimate to seeing a woman's name on the ballot and to dislodge even a little bit the very strong association between politics and masculinity. Still, electoral victories remained frustratingly out of reach. More than a dozen black women, ran for office on the Republican, American Labor, Liberal, and Socialist Party tickets between 1934 and 1950. They ran against each other, and they ran against black men as well as against white women and white men. Their numerous unsuccessful campaigns confirmed that the working of racialized gender discrimination posed a significant hurdle in a particularly important way in New York. The Democratic Party dominated politics, and it resisted running women for office for black women for office for 35 years after they won the right to vote. Finally, in 1954, Bessie Buchanan, a Harlem socialite and Democratic Party activist, convinced Tammany Hall to support her, and she won her office for state assembly, and it was a history-making victory. At the same time, black women endeavored to gain access to government power through other avenues. Longtime YWCA administrator and a former New York City New Deal appointee, Anna Arnold Hedgeman, became the executive secretary of the National Council for a Permanent Fair Employment Practices Commission in 1944. She spoke at FEPC rallies and led strategy meetings on how to get the legislation through Congress. But in the emerging Cold War context, where many government programs were labeled as communist in order to kill them, the FEPC budget was slashed in half and then eliminated completely in 1946. Nevertheless, her determined efforts and great skill as a public speaker attracted national attention. Congressman William Dawson of Chicago brought her on board the National Committee to re-elect President Truman, and for her very successful efforts, she received a high-level federal post. Even as the Cold War escalated to a national level of hysteria, Hedgeman used her position at the Federal Security Agency, which is today the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, to advocate for socialized medicine, arguing that it was, quote, the only way to improve the health and living conditions of minority groups. It's demonstrated her strong belief in a strong activist state which should work on behalf of people's well-being. It also attracted attention of McCarthyites. During a HUAC investigation, Hedgeman was asked, not surprisingly, if she was a communist. She responded, quote, I'd had so much difficulty trying to secure my part of American democracy that I had no time to study communism. Regardless of the government's suspicions, though, Hedgeman was not a radical or a communist sympathizer, but a Cold War liberal who simultaneously embraced American democracy and committed her professional life to making it much more expansive, inclusive, and fair. When the Republicans won in 1953, Hedgeman returned to New York. A group of Harlem citizens welcomed her back by requesting that she run for the Manhattan Borough presidency on the ticket with the mayoral campaign Robert Wagner Jr., who was the son of the towering New Deal figure. Although she was open to the idea, Hedgeman knew clubhouse politics and decided against challenging Hoolan Jack, an African-American Tammany leader in Harlem. Reflecting on the persistence of gender biases in party politics, Hedgeman wrote in an autobiography that, quote, Jack was vehement about the fact that a woman would not be acceptable to borough presidency, although I will add another parenthetical that just 8 years later, Constance Baker Motley proved that point wrong as well. She campaigned for the Democrats nonetheless, which proved much more than her loyalties. It also demonstrated her savvy and her ambition. When the Tammany slate won, newly elected Mayor Wagner named Hedgeman as one of the 11 members of his cabinet. With this post, she became the highest position African-American in City Hall. Although the appointment was rightly celebrated as political progress for the black community, the victory was not without its blemishes. Rather than a $15,000 a year post, which was promised, Hedgeman was given a vaguely defined $8,000 a year position. She understood racism, sexism, and party politics too well to have been terribly surprised, but she determined to make the most of her position in any case. She raised concerns about access to affordable housing, better schools, and health care for the poor and working people at cabinet meetings and spoke about them publicly. However, she was unable to influence the mayor, the city's black leadership, or the city council. She ultimately found her limited capacity to bring about change from within the government frustrating, and she left the administration in 1958. Yet ultimately, Hedgeman was unable to abandon political activism. Not only did she accept the offer from a Bronx-based insurgent political organization to run for Congress in 1960, unsuccessfully, but she also helped organize the 1963 March on Washington and coordinated lobbying efforts when the 1964 Civil Rights Act was stalled in Congress. Fully appreciative of its limitations, Hedgeman never remained determined to influence the ways government power was allocated. I'll switch now to my last brief discussion here on Shirley Chisholm. Chisholm was an excellent student of politics. She carefully navigated the treacherous political terrain to a historic victory in 1968 to become the first black woman elected to the United States Congress. Her first few months in Washington, the contours of Chisholm's political agenda emerged. Her legislative program exhibited a political vision that went beyond most of her liberal colleagues. An articulate and passionate speaker, Chisholm was unafraid to advocate the primacy of federal authority over state governments in policy making and spending. Putting the needs of African Americans, women, and the poor at the center of her legislative program, she accused middle-class liberals who designed the war on poverty of not understanding the realities of poverty and discrimination. Chisholm co-sponsored bills on domestic policy that increased federal support of workers' rights to unionize, which at this point sounds almost hard to imagine, the elimination of all forms of discrimination, government-guaranteed full employment programs, educational opportunities for those who needed it, health insurance for domestic workers, increased federal funds for housing, reformed welfare laws, that substantively supported poor women without judgment or punishment, the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, and the repeal of laws that made abortion illegal. And that's just a few of her many concerns. And she was equally clear about foreign policy agenda, which called for the immediate cessation of the war in Vietnam, the abolition of the draft, an amnesty for draft resistors, and a curtailment of federal spending on the military. Her vision was bold and activist. Her capacity to shepherd it through Congress proved to be another matter altogether. As she engaged in struggles that often emerged from the intersection of gender, race, and class politics, Chisholm wrote about her political philosophy in her 1970 autobiography, Unbought and Unbossed, and in so doing addressed the ideas and tactics of radical black activists, declaring herself a, quote, militant. In sympathy with racial militants' critiques of the United States, Chisholm nevertheless defended her decision to engage the system in the particular way she did. She argued that hers was a different of tactics and elaborated on the treacherous position she felt African Americans were in. Quote, "I'm no fool, brothers and sisters. I'm a pragmatist. What is the sense of shooting, burning, and killing? All they have to do is press a button in Washington and every black neighborhood will be surrounded by troops with bayonets. What are you going to do against the massive forces of government? You are 14 or 15% of the population with no real economic or political power. When you get through burning, won't you still have to go to the man and ask for an apartment? I know I'm here in Congress, part of the establishment, but I haven't sold out. I'm fighting within the system. There is no other place to fight if you only understood it. There's no other way for us to survive because we really don't have anything." This was Chisholm's most explicit and comprehensive assessment of the society she was not just living in, but the government of which she was a part. That she could so effectively position herself as an insider-outsider speaks not only to Chisholm's skills as a politician, but also to the complexity of her political vision, which was at once highly critical of the system, but also appreciative of its potential for change. There's obviously much, much more to say about Shirley Chisholm as a politician, a political thinker, and a feminist, and we can take that up in the Q&A. Just a few closing comments here. Over the course of 60 years, African American women could count some notable successes that resulted from their state-centered activism. They mediated white women's racism in the suffrage movement. They proved their loyalty and worth to male political party bosses so that they could have a chance at the polls. And they won over voters, first at the city and state seats, and then for national office. As this brief history suggests, it was essential for black female candidates to gain acceptance among Democratic Party stalwarts if they hoped to advance their political careers, particularly in New York City. Those who ran on other party ballots in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s helped accustom voters to seeing women as candidates, but they lost every election they ran in. Women like Lane, Hedgeman, and Chisholm developed a broad vision of politics. Aware of its historic limitations, the state was not an automatic ally for African American women to turn to, especially for those who had migrated from the South in the wake of the Jim Crow takeover. At the same time, mindful of the ways political patronage worked in a city as rapidly changing as New York, they decided to strategically work with it, to neutralize it as an obstacle where possible, and to make it a productive tool in the fight for social, political, and economic rights. With the emergence of the Cold War in the 1940s, politically left-leaning black women found themselves targeted by vitriolic silencing campaigns, as was the case for a majority of progressive activists. But for the growing numbers of black women who ensconced themselves in the Democratic Party, the goals were to expand its agenda and to secure positions of leadership. Mary McLeod Bethune did path-breaking work in the Democratic Party during the New Deal. Building on that effort, Hedgeman served as an appointee in the Truman administration. Through the 1960s and 70s, she and other African American women like Shirley Chisholm came to represent the most liberal part of the Democratic Party. Long after the McCarthy era did its damage, they remained committed to and fought for a progressive vision of social, political, and economic justice. Together, their collective histories reveal not only the distinctive concerns and historical forces that shaped their political activism, but also the ways these dynamic women endeavored and at times succeeded in transforming the American political party system, its laws, and its policies. Thank you.
Good morning. This is not how I planned it. My bag did not arrive, so here I am. And also the cab dropped me on the wrong side of Morningside, so I had a little mountain to climb this morning. So there are mountains in New York, but I'm very happy to be here. I do have a PowerPoint, and hopefully, I don't know if you can see it. Here's my clicker. Just click in the middle.
Can you
or I guess I'll figure it out.
Get the lights down a little bit.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
My presentation today is on Jessie Parkhurst Guzman, Tuskegee's forgotten scholar activist for civic democracy. This is a quote from Jessie Parkhurst Guzman. For me, democracy is a real living force, a vital force, and as such, it must apply to every phase of life. This project is part of a larger project. It's a collaborative work with two other Tuskegee professors on the women of Tuskegee, 1881 to 1981, the first 100 years of women at Tuskegee. And so my work on Guzman today, however, is going to focus on her political activism, her campaign. When she decided to run for office in Macon County, Alabama in 1954, she was 55. She had spent more than 30 years at Tuskegee Institute in many different roles. She was a professor of sociology and history, dean of women, and at this point she was director of the Department of Records and Research. She had won numerous awards for her work, so she had no need to prove herself. Also, to set the context a bit, Brown versus Board of Education was wending its way through the court, but it would not be decided until May. Also, the McCarthy hearings, televised hearings, were about to get underway in April. At this point, no black person had run for any office, however humble, in Macon County, Alabama since Reconstruction. She was probably the most highly educated person to try for public office. She was born in Savannah in 1898 to a large family, and probably that's why she was adopted by godparents so that she could go to school at Clark, Atlanta, which had an elementary school and a high school. She had a BA from Howard in 1919, and from this prestigious institution in 1929. She studied at many other universities, including a fellowship for the study of Negro women in American life in University of Chicago. It's important to understand that her candidacy was part of a collective political effort. She was sponsored by the Tuskegee Civic Association. Now, it started as a men's club, but actually before that there had been a women's club. But in 1941, they made a very important step. They decided to change their name and their constitution and to admit women, and their aim became intelligent study and social action. And by 1952, it's not exactly clear exactly when she joined, probably soon after it changed its name, but by 52 she was a member of the executive cabinet, and her longtime friend and colleague, Professor Charles Gomillion, was the longtime president. It's also key to realize that this organization did not really take off as a dynamic political organization until women joined. Eventually, at the height of its activism, it attracted hundreds to its meetings. This is a meeting from 1958. The TCA had a remarkably, from what our research is showing so far, egalitarian approach in keeping with its belief in democracy. Women insisted on paying the same amount of dues. They originally were paying half, but they were raised to the same amount. And this is the executive committee in 1960. It's roughly a third, 5 out of 18 are women, and just think what the U.S. Congress would look like if we had almost a third women in that institution. They undertook an ambitious program of civic education. They did many, many things, including registering hundreds of voters, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that work really involved. They sued the Macon County Board of Registrars. Again, I'll speak about that. But they appeared despite, and by the way, women ran for office within the organization, defeated men to hold key positions, and it seems to have been, though, an organization that operated by consensus decision-making. This was a quotation from a campaign speech she made to the Federated Colored Women's Clubs. We must do the things that have to be done where we are. Our first efforts may or may not be successful, but eventually they will succeed. So it's not clear exactly how the TCA chose Jessie Guzman, or whether, but it is clear that she believed that black women had a part to play in politics, that they should be concerned about the community well-being, that they should run for political office even in the South, and that they could be leaders as well as white men. Now, it's also important, though, to realize that their candidacy was about more than winning political office and political representation, as key and as important as that was. They were also concerned with issues. The TCA, in keeping with its motto, intelligent study, and they later added courageous social action, they had studied the schools in Macon County, and they had found that there was vast disparities. There were 3 white schools and 52 black schools, and the funds were very disproportionately allocated by every measure: salary, condition of the buildings, transportation, everything. So her candidacy was about the right of children to an equal education. And as she said, each child is an American citizen. Public funds should be so distributed that not 1 cent more should be spent on one than the other. So this was a campaign about breaking the barrier of segregation, yes, but it was a campaign about the well-being of the community. Now, like many of your early candidates, she knew that she was going to lose. That was the vote. And by the way, the primary had only recently opened to black people. It was a whites-only primary, so it was the first time a black candidate could run. She ran. And that was the vote. Now, you have to also understand that even though Macon County was 85% African American, because of the shenanigans of the Board of Registrars, black applicants had to fill out long, complicated applications, memorize the Constitution. One tiny mistake, your application was rejected, while illiterate white voters were registered at any time in any place. I mean, they had to chase the Board of Registrars around. They were hiding in the bank vault and all kinds of things, for which the TCA sued, among its many other lawsuits. But now the election revealed some very interesting things. The TCA was emerging as a political force. The candidates it backed made it to runoff, and in some cases won because of TCA support, because they were approaching a third of the electorate. What was also very interesting is that the white candidate, her opponent, the incumbent, attracted more black support than she attracted white support. She attracted almost no white support. The main impact, I'm arguing today, of her candidacy is that it sent shockwaves through the white political establishment. And shockwaves is a quotation from a New Yorker journalist who came to Tuskegee to report on the election. For the daring to run for office, and this is a quotation from Jessie Guzman later, she said, because of this political gesture, which was simply an incident in the whole chain of events by which the Tuskegee Civic Association had for many years attempted to bring true Americanism to our locality, we were gerrymandered right out of the city of Tuskegee by our state legislature and threatened with piecemeal division of our county because we dared to express the desire to have a voice in our own government. And that's a map of what the 28-sided district, and you can see what a peculiar map it is. It was drawn to include every single white voter and to exclude as many black voters as possible so that only 12 black voters remain within the city limits of Tuskegee. Now, this act, this outrageous act by the Alabama state legislature, absolutely galvanized black resistance in Macon County. That mass meeting, that picture I showed you, was a part of that response. And they also launched a boycott like the Montgomery boycott, although they didn't call it a boycott because boycotts were illegal in Alabama. It was a trade with your friends campaign, and it was extremely successful. And it also led to a very crucial Supreme Court victory. And they were in the Supreme Court a number of times, but Gomillion versus Lightfoot is today a cornerstone of voting rights legislation that protect minority rights. The impact of her candidacy, I'm suggesting, is, yes, she lost the battle, but she won the bigger war. The first integrated city council was elected in Tuskegee in '64. Her friend eventually was elected to the post that she had run for, and her candidacy paved the way for many of the successes of the later Voting Rights Act. Guzman continued to be a scholar. She issued the Race Relations Report from Tuskegee. It had been the annual lynching report started by Monroe Work, but after Brown versus Board of Education, it was changed to the annual Race Relations Report. She wrote many scholarly articles and monographs. She also continued as a political activist. She became the executive secretary of the Southern Education Conference Fund, which funded lots of democratic projects, including the Freedom Riders in Mississippi. And at age, say, 86, and I love stories like this because women going in their 80s and 90s, she wrote a terrific book on the Tuskegee Civic Association. I want to close my presentation today with some remarks in response to Jacqueline Dowd Hall's challenge not to kind of bowdlerize, produce these ideal images of the heroes of the civil rights movement and reduce it to a sort of a minimalist program of interracialism and integration, and also to sort of neatly package it into one decade as if it no longer is really relevant. It's just sort of, we did that. So I want to suggest that even though I think Jessie Guzman is a hero, she lived a life with incredible integrity, but she was, she had her middle class biases, and her life is also not a simple story of triumph. She never was elected to any public office, and she ran again in '66 for the state legislature. But I think her work with the TCA and the other activists in the TCA show that their aims were not simply voting rights and integration, although those were huge, and dismantling that system of segregation was an enormous accomplishment. But they had a bigger dream in mind, in fact, nothing short of civic democracy. They also accomplished judicial reform, so that part of their work was suing so that African Americans could serve on juries. They wanted public services in black neighborhoods. They wanted fair employment practices. They wanted integrated quality schools, and they believed in the principle of the dignity and worth of every person. So I think in this Arab Spring, it has demonstrated perhaps something that we may have forgotten, the power of that very simple but very profound idea that every person has worth, and that as citizens we all have a right to have a say in how we are governed. And although she is in danger of being forgotten, and although neither she nor the TCA achieved all of their objectives, her work, along with the remarkable democratic organization she was a part of, deserve to be remembered. Without women like Jessie Guzman, we would be much farther than we are from civic democracy in America. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And
I don't know how to turn this on.
I certainly don't.
Okay. Maybe we should go back to the picture of her anyway.
Oh, he can.
He can turn it off. Okay.
Thank you. So you've heard these great, or excerpts, I should say, brief excerpts from these great papers that I had the privilege of reading, much longer and much richer versions, and I've made my comments on those, although I think you've gotten the essence of the papers from the presentations this morning. I should say again that Sharon Harley, who was unable to get here because of flight problems yesterday, was to present a paper that included attention to Nannie Helen Burroughs and her political activism, certainly, and her interaction and demands on the state from a different place. And so I just wanted to mention that, and of course she sends her regrets. So what we have here then are works on three or four actually quite different black women activists who looked to hold the state accountable in its failed obligations to black citizens. We see as well in all of the papers several levels of state-directed activism and agitation, whether through Pauli Murray's work to open jury service, to Anna Hedgeman and Shirley Chisholm's runs for elected office in New York City, and Guzman's early candidacy for school board in Tuskegee, which you've just heard about, and Burroughs' work, which had been a challenge to World War I era laws that mandated the work of black women during World War I. So for all of these women, as I was reading these papers, as diverse as they are, and lives, that spread across time and space, in all of these papers we see a unified theory of state obligation emerging, a passionate embrace of the rights of citizenship, a set of reflections on democracy and civic duty, which leads me to ask this question, or the series of questions. If we take these black women seriously as intellectuals, which is our claim to fame here this weekend, then what kind of intellectuals are they? If we take their speeches and their writings and their lived actions as evidence, and if we treat them as the political theorists I believe them each to be, and this is a term that I had actually written a couple of days ago, and then it was repeated actually in panel yesterday. So I think it is a really good way to think about the work of these women and their lives. What kind of theoretical interventions do we see them making? If we were to try to pull them into conversation with one another, could we help create a new collective of Black political theorizing if we place these women front and center? And certainly they would be joined by others, but place their ideas, all formed in different moments and from different venues and institutions that mark the century that just ended. What would we then have? What would we learn? What could we teach differently? How would we view the history of Black politics and Black political struggle differently? What difference would it make? What new lessons will we discover if we re-envision the always fraught and I think often treacherous relationship between Black women, Black communities, and the state through the lens of their ideas and their works? What would the Black political history of the 20th century teach us about our present moment if we start with these women and women like them? So these are all really lovely questions, none of which I'm going to try to answer here, but I think they are helpful for us to consider as we consider the enormous potential that this kind of work offers us. In each case, these papers involve the very important work of recovery, of recuperation, retrieval, and the work then calls us to respond with a bold reimagining of the past which these women inhabited and struggled to understand and to overcome. So I really thank all of the panelists for their hard work in bringing to light this work and bringing these women into our lives this morning. So to me, part of that process of reimagining will require us to engage these women critically, that is, to treat them and their ideas with respectful engagement that does not shy away from critique of what works and what they think, what does not, what makes sense, what was fresh, what was short-sighted, what was wrong. These are all very strong, smart, principled women. They and their ideas can take that kind of criticism, and I think they would expect no less from us. And if we believe, as I do, that they are worthy of overdue attention, then we just need also to bring our best critical eye to them and to their work. They deserve no less, and I think they would expect no less from us. So I want to, just in terms of trying to think of a kind of a methodological approach, like what do we do with this new work? I'll turn now to the women of the hour, the women we've been hearing about, Anna Arnold Hedgeman and Shirley Chisholm, Pauli Murray and Jessie Goodsman. I think, again, with special appreciation to the women on this panel who brought their stories to us today. But it seems to me that the other central character in these papers is the state itself. So I want to start there because these women look to the state not so much for assistance or help, which is certainly a role the state must and should play, but they call upon the mechanisms of the state to meet its own obligations to them as U.S. citizens, at the same time that they endorse the citizens' duty to do just that, and to also to be in this kind of reciprocal relationship with the state, duty, obligation, and demands as part of a triangle. So in Julie Gallagher's paper on New York women in New York politics, we see then a tracing of the predecessors to Chisholm's first status, giving witness to the long line of women who ran for political office as Republicans, as socialists, as Democrats. Hedgeman's own path to City Hall really began in Washington, which is always very interesting to me, through appointive offices and positions. And in fact, her career would run back and forth from New York to Washington and all over the country for her entire career, even though New York was her base. So that even in talking about the state, we're talking about varied expressions of the state, local and national, and actually in some cases international. Gallagher argues that Hedgeman believed that the government was the best hope for economic, social, and political redistribution. And her longer paper also actually includes some reference to Pauli Murray in that same battle that we hear about in Meredith's paper. And so when we finally do get to Chisholm and to her story, after 2 generations of unsuccessful runs by other women, she would then, of course, in Congress champion the needs of poor people, women, and children, and the state's obligation to them. She was forced, in a way, in this wonderful passage that Julie read, to defend her work within the system. Because remember, when she comes to Congress in 1968, this is the height of Black power, of Vietnam, of rioting in the streets. This is it's a complicated time to want to be elected into a system which is under such fierce and I think justified attack, and not just from Black people. So that the underlying political problem, it seems to me, is the search for some sort of institutional basis of strength for Black people, and that's that lovely quote where she is sort of recognizing that searching for some sort of basis for strength leads her to the Congress, or leads her to serve within the state. And so my question then for Julie is how the rubric of insider, outsider, or outsiders, insider, because there are different manifestations of it, how that helps us understand that philosophy which she gives us here, which is very highly critical of the system, but she's not really arguing to want to change or dismantle the system as such, but she wants to use it to do some good. I mean, really, how radical is that? How progressive is that? These are the questions that were put to her by her critics in a probably much more blunt way, but how do we make up her understanding, what do we make of her own understanding of her own position, and eventually that of other Black women elected to Congress, because then a handful would follow in the subsequent years, ones that are also, very dear to our hearts, like Barbara Jordan and a whole host of others. And the question I really have is, are Black women ever truly considered political insiders? I asked that in an age when a Black president of these United States is yet to be accorded insider status or to shed his outsider status. So what are the strengths or limitations of that? This positioning of Gutzman as she makes her decision in Alabama to run, and which has been shown to us really here, and I won't summarize the paper much since Nat has given me already my 5-minute warning.
Yep, that's why you put me here.
I know, and I have trained you yet too well, because I would do the same thing. I'm trying to talk fast. If she had not believed so much in democracy and in the duty of ordinary citizens to live up to its principles, this is the way you began your paper, she could very easily have not gone to the trouble of running, and risk really of running for public office in Macon County, Alabama in 1954. And so here we have it again, this sort of faith in democracy and this felt citizen obligation and duty to make that democracy work for Black people. She argues above all that Gutzman believed in civic engagement and duty, and in the longer paper, and I thank you for this, she counters Norell's arguments about Gutzman being naive to have run at all, and also raises questions about how it is that Gutzman was chosen to be the first candidate, and you're searching for kind of explanations. I think the fact that this organization had so many Black women in it is the reason, or a key reason. And also the other thing I wanted to point out is that we're talking about an organization here that does not mirror the kind of religious hierarchical organizations that we see Ella Baker complaining about so bitterly for her time in the civil rights movement and with SCLC. The other point that I think is worth emphasizing here, and we can talk about this, is the central role that Black colleges and Black college towns play in the civil rights movement, whether it's Tuskegee, Selma, Greensboro, or Birmingham, where people who are on the ground in those communities become so important. And so I would, I would say for the purpose of the paper, I'd like to hear more of Gutzman's own voice, and because she was a great writer, and also she expressed, what is her expressed kind of political philosophy beyond this belief in democracy, which she holds. What is her thinking as a political strategist beyond her own kind of campaign? And finally, we end with Paula Murray. I'm coming back there. I think the best known of the women that we're discussing here. And her focus, Meredith's focus on Murray's legal work to end the practice of all-white juries and all-male juries, and forget that those things were so tightly coupled, or I had forgotten in a sense. But also, I think the important point, which may not have been made in the paper as delivered, was that Murray comes to her heightened sense of gender discrimination at Howard, where the predominantly black male ethos rendered her silent and frustrated and often furious. And I think we need to be reminded that it's in response to that experience that she coins the term Jane Crow. It's not from riding segregated trains, it's from her experience in Howard and dealing with, quite frankly, black male colleagues and sexism. So we see her here at the center of two struggles, one for civil rights, one for, kind of pushing black civil rights activists to, they did not want to muddy the waters by also talking about sex, and certainly her white feminist colleagues trying to get them to take race seriously. So she's living out what we come to think later of this intersectionality. And so what's very interesting to me is that we see these race-sex analogies that she's having to disentangle in this work on privilege and jury duty. And so I would just want to sort of compliment you both on the subtlety and the power and the eloquence of the paper, and on your use and reliance on Murray's words and writings. Two quick questions. One has to do with the notion of collaborations and coalition building, which she's certainly at the center of. I noticed that a number of the papers that you rely on the reports are co-authored. It's not just Murray, it's someone else. Who's that other person? And you can answer that later, but what do we then do when we're doing intellectual history and the person is also not just working alone, but really always working on committees or in collaboration? And so those are just a couple of thoughts that might send us off as we begin to think about these women. And to also say that the one piece that I loved in the Paul and Mary is the 1970 paper, The Liberation of Black Women, which lays out a theory of intersectionality before it's even, explicitly and right on point, and that essay in particular needs, I think, to be highlighted. My final comment is that Gutzman is very important to me as an African Americanist, because her work in those archives and the production of those yearbooks, and also of the clipping files that have been there long before there were digitized collections, were absolutely central to both of my books. And so when I saw the mention of her name, I knew immediately that part of her life, but I had no idea of the rest of her life. So thank you for that. And I think that's enough, and we'll go on with comments from the audience. But thank you all three. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Savage.
Thank you, Nat.
Yes, before we begin the Q&A, I would like to provide each of the panelists 3 minutes to respond to the comments.
3 minutes each or together?
3 minutes each to respond to the comments from Dr. Savage. You may begin in any order, and you also have the right to decline my request for your response. But I want to make sure that you get an opportunity before we go to Q&A.
Yeah. Thank you for your comments. And I've thought about a lot of these things a lot. I think the state itself is central. I think, frankly, as I did this, I struggled so hard against my cynicism about the limitations, the limitations that the state has when you don't have networks, when you don't have the power brokers, when you don't have the corporate. So much power takes place outside the state. The state is a facilitator of movements of resources. And so I think about, did these women have hope in the state? Did they have faith in it? I think I would say no, probably not much, but they had hope out of necessity. And so I think that's the way I would frame it. I've thought a lot about, do I think Chisholm is radical? And she wasn't out to dismantle capitalism as it was per se, but I do believe that if the vision that these women had fought for ever came to fruition, we would live in such a different world that it would be a radical change. And we are nowhere near that, and so I can't say that. But they, Hedgeman spent time in the South. in Mississippi after she graduated from college. She was horrified by her experiences there, and then came back to the North with a new set of very critical eyes. I opened my book with a quote from her that said, "I never thought of myself as a black nationalist, but I think I am," in the 1920s. But she continued to both be aware of the needs for separatist struggle, and yet committed ultimately that if power really was going to be fought for her, it was going to happen vis-a-vis the power brokers in the United States.
That's great.
I think you've given me a lot of food for thought, but I think one thing that's worth stressing, I think in a way the Tuskegee Civic Association was this grassroots democracy in action, and it was secular. In fact, at one point they wanted to, there was some strife with the religious leaders were upset that Charles Gomillion refused to attend church. It was not his belief. And they wanted to de-elect him, and the membership said, no, absolutely not. He's our president. So I think it was I think there was a lot of amazing, grassroots, real democracy and respect for, but they believed in that, the Bill of Rights could take you pretty far. And I'm not sure that's radical, but on the other hand, if the government really lived up to what it's supposed to be, maybe as you're saying, that would be radical. And I agree with the role of black institutions. Tuskegee was incredibly important, even though the leadership of Tuskegee had to be a little bit careful, because the Alabama state legislature really wanted to shut Tuskegee up, but Gomillion was protected by Tuskegee leadership and allowed to continue. He wasn't fired, although they were pressured to fire him and others. So finally, Wisman's life is so rich, and there's so much that she's written. The thing about, I would say, her as a theorist, I think she's somebody who believes, like Gomillion, you have to know what the facts are. It's about studying. When they undertook action, they researched, they did surveys, they really grounded their activism in knowledge. So I think there's a kind of pragmatism there and a kind of respect for the facts. That I would say, but it's also hard to divide Guzman as a theorist from the TCA or Gomillion, because, as I said, it was consensus building, and so they did so much together.
Thank you.
So I appreciate your comments, and I think one of the most interesting things about studying Polly Murray, and I'm studying, she's kind of a final figure in my work, which starts with Reconstruction, is that she goes to great lengths to challenge what she calls, in my favorite quote, the weird world of all white, all male juries. And she's talking kind of to two groups. One that find it weird that black men are left off juries, and the other that find it weird that white women are off juries. And sort of in these trajectories of, speaking with the NAACP on one hand, who of course her mentor Leon Ransom is a huge part of, and speaking to these white women organizations who have been clamoring for decades to get on juries, and with some success or other. And so she's really the figure that seems to pull these two things together. And I think in trying to combat those notions that white women need to be protected from the courtroom by being excluded, when black men are really the ones in need of protection through there, it's this sort of odd dual conversation, and she really brings it together, and I think she does so, to answer your question more directly, through a strategic collaboration where she seeks out the ACLU as not a women's organization and not a central, civil rights organization like the NAACP, to try to merge these conversations. And so she does that by finding sympathy with various groups. So the people who actually are in Alabama litigating this case, Charles Morgan, who's really concerned about adding this kind of sex aspect that doesn't need to be there because it's not the primal thing, and Dorothy Kenyon, who on the other hand says, this is why I'm here, right? So she's able to do this sort of collaboration, and And I think that's in large part why she has a lot of co-authors like Dorothy Kenyon as a kind of building consensus around this issue and gaining support from various people. And so it is kind of hard to tease her analysis out of it, but when you read it in conjunction with some of her earlier or more personal works and her later works on the ERA, which I think are fascinating and I need to do more with, that you can see that this idea of Jane Crow and really the analysis about this analogy is in her voice, even through these articles. So that would be sort of my my gut feeling, but it is something I probably need to figure out how to argue it in a more explicit way.
I should tell you, you probably know, Pauli Murray ran for city council in New York City in '49, and Ella Baker ran in '53. So many women actually decided that at one point that running for office might be something to at least consider.
Again, I'd like to thank the panel, and now we'll open up for Q&A. Yes.
I love this panel because y'all are talking about two of my favorite people, Anna Arnold and Pauli Murray.
A little louder.
Speak up.
Yes.
So I have two questions, one for Meredith and one for Julie. Meredith, one of the things that's interesting to me about Pauli Murray is the points that you raised about her sort of legal theorizing. Do you think that it would be appropriate to situate her as a precursor to critical race theory? Because if she's a theorist of intersectionality and she's doing this early work in the 60s and 70s around the role of women and gender and race within legal scholarship, even though she doesn't make the same ultimate moves that critical race theorists make, she is setting the stage for the kinds of questions that they seem to answer. So I wonder what your feeling is about that. Does that seem viable or does it seem like a stretch? I mean, I think about that in relation to the fact that she does go on to found one of the early legal studies programs at Brandeis, right? My question for Julie is, do you think that Anna Arnold Hedgeman's political theory is laid out at all in the two books that she writes later, Trumpet Sounds and The Gift of Chaos? Because I was thinking, I haven't read The Gift of Chaos, but Trumpet Sounds, she's specifically sort of resisting King's I Have a Dream construction. And so I'm wondering just, what your sense of those texts is in terms of thinking of her as a theorist.
Good questions.
So I really appreciate your question, and I have to admit that I have been really staying very close to that 1979 deadline just in this. So I haven't put a whole lot of thought, but I think it's something that I could definitely see connections to just, in this sort of moment that I have to think about it. I absolutely think that there would be some connection. I don't know how strong, to say.
I'm wondering about that because, I know that she's not radical in the same way.
Right.
She doesn't think about rights in the same way. She doesn't think about the state in the same way, certainly not. But we always sort of think intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw,
Right.
critical race folks, but there is no construction that Kimberly Crenshaw can do without, state's laws on race and color, that talks about the fact that the law has particular notions about race, and then later, as you say, about gender. So that's the only sort of thing. So I wouldn't want to say that she is a critical race theorist, right?
Right. No, certainly not. But I can see where that link would possibly be. It's a really great question.
Hedgeman wrote The Trumpet Sounds in '64, and one of the most powerful things she does say, and she's critical of King's speech, is, why couldn't you have said, "We have a dream"? And when I read that, it was really devastating and so powerful at the same time. And she did a lot of work. She had a column for a while in the New York Age about the importance of recognizing the role of African American women and their significant unrecognized work for generations. There's a lot of pathos in her writing. I mean, there's a lot of emotion and sadness and inspiration. I mean, they both ultimately are, both critical and optimistic. And I think her faith was hugely important in that as well. She ended up working with the National Council of Churches for quite a while. And I read Gift of Chaos a long time ago and would have to revisit it to think about specifically, but I think her ideas about the state, about change, about racial equality, and when she was working for the YWCA after she came out of Mississippi and was in Springfield, Ohio, the scales fell off her eyes about just how awful racism was, out of the Jim Crow South. And, at points she says, I'm so sick and tired of people asking me, what do black people want? She's like, what do we want? We want to be treated like human beings. We want to be treated like, we want the rights of citizenship. Stop, why, that's such a stupid question. You could just hear her frustrations with that. And kind of like with Chisholm, I think if the world that Hedgeman believed it, wanted, ever came to pass, the society would be so different that we wouldn't recognize it, because rights would be redistributed, resources would be redistributed. But she also does some spade work for the State Department. She went to India as part of their effort to challenge the ideas that the United States was a racist country. So she's complicated, and you can't peg her down easily. At one point I was like, you're so, you throw me a curveball every time I think I've got you a little bit clear. But she's both critical and optimistic in the same way, and I do think those are wonderful books to read. I'd love for this trumpet sound to come back into press, because I think it's so powerful.
Can I just say one thing? She also was very active during the March on Washington in '63. She was a part of the people who were clamoring to have a woman speak. She was really kind of down, very critical of that during that debate, if I remember correctly.
Here, and then Sister Sonia. Yes.
And would people introduce themselves?
Yeah, and please remember to say your name and to stand and articulate, or project, sorry. Yes, thank you.
My name is Sarah Haley. I was struck most by this in terms of Shirley Chisholm, but in just thinking about Black women's intellectual traditions, thank you, that you guys have discussed today, I was wondering where you saw critiques of militarized state violence coming in, because I was really struck by this in Shirley Chisholm, in that quote you read. And to what degree is this a belief, right, in a liberal democracy? And to what extent is this about survival and thriving in the context of the really radical description of militarized state violence that you read? And to what extent did that influence the political theory of Pauline Murray or Guzman or any of the other women you guys?
That's a great question. From the beginning of civil rights activism, even during the Civil War, African Americans in New York City had to contend with police brutality, and in other places. The state, this is why it's such an interesting project, because the state is never an easy ally. They know that they are tangling with the devil in some respects, but they also know that the state is about the only thing that has the, if you can't find a way to work with it, it could crush you, and it does at times. There were, police brutality sparked a riot in 1900 that James Weldon Johnson wrote about, and it continues to resurface. And so Ella Baker's significant work on fighting police brutality, it is a continual struggle and part of their longer, much richer civil rights activism throughout the entire late 19th and early and 20th century. So they're attentive to the power of the state, and that's why, to me, when I said, do they have faith in the state? Probably not. But do they have? It's a weird hope, because it's a necessity to shift this, because the power is always there to crush, and we've seen it used. I teach just outside of Philadelphia. We know what the city government, police force did in Philadelphia. So, dropping a bomb on people. So the state is always a potential significant threat to existence, and so you've got to find a way to mobilize it, minimize it.
Do you want to say anything to that? Are you okay?
I'm okay.
Next question.
My name is Maisha. I'm a rising senior at Notre Dame. My question is for Dr. Gallagher and then the panel as a whole. But the terms political activists are used to describe Black women who are involved in politics. But is there any way to make a distinction between a political activist and a political actor? Because there are certain women that use this system as a way to achieve things, and then there are other women who work outside of the system. So I think there should be a distinction there, but I'm not quite sure where to draw the line.
Sure.
I think that's a wonderful question. And these women would not want to box themselves in, and I don't mean to box them in either. I mean, they were involved in women's organizations. They were involved in sororities, whether it was the Deltas, the National Council of Negro Women. They were involved in the NAACP. I don't know if they were involved in the UNIA. Although Chisholm's father was an ardent Garveyite, and she talked early on about, you know, laying in bed at night listening to him talk about, with his friends around the kitchen table, about race pride. And so they strive to become political actors in the formal sense, but their political activism is, I use the term very broadly, because in the book I look at people who are continuously fighting in grassroots struggles from outside. The state becomes a target in my stories always, because that is where so much power is facilitated, if not inhered. And so that people understand, they use the courts from the outside, they try and mobilize. Many of these women are also taking part in direct active protests and boycotts in Harlem. I mean, they're all over the place. They're very busy. But they also, as part of their activism, at points try and become political actors themselves. They want their hands on the levers of power. Now, to me, I end the study struggling with the fact that even when you get your hands on the lever of power, it's slippery and elusive, because that's not the only place it is. And if you don't come from these, you know, country club environments where power brokers are also outside the state, it's a limited power.
I do think we should be careful, though, to not talk about the state always as if it's something out there. I mean, I think the point of the TCA was, this is our government, and we should be on the school board, we should be in the city council. And yes, I think you're right that it's actually what happened in Tuskegee it's a much more complicated story, because the TCA wanted to share power with what would be the white minority. But the white minority, you know, they tried an integrated government, but eventually what happened is that Macon County essentially became an all-black county. So it is tricky. The formal structures of power are very tricky, but I still think the concept that the state is also, in a democratic theory, it's supposed to be we the people as well.
Well, I would just say for Polly Murray, in a very quick way, of course, for the condensed version of this paper, I cut most of this, but I think she almost defies categorization. She is a poet, a priest. I mean, she is an activist in every sense of the word, and I think that she is very pragmatic in the ways that I'm interested in her work, in working with the state to try to alleviate some of the violence, you know, that the black community faces, especially in the South. And so I would see her as kind of transcending and in some ways being both of those at the same time.
Good morning, I'm Sonia Ramsey. I had a question.
Use it.
Hello? Okay.
There you go.
I had a question for Dr. Gebhard and a comment. I really appreciated your paper because it sheds light on the role of educator activists and intellectual leaders. We think of the civil rights movement as ministers and students, but it's nice to hear more about the educators. What I wanted to know about Dr. Goodsman, what was her reaction among women's groups, among students, and how did she cross class lines in her activism? Just more of her context of her work.
Well, I know that she was a member of the NAACP, and also she worked for the Women's International Peace and Freedom League. She was part of that. She was a member of a sorority, so she did work with women's groups. And I mean, the voter registration work that they did was voter education, and it took hours and hours of their time, unpaid hours, by the way. I mean, this is on top of, you know, I know some of us in the room who are teachers. I mean, right now, I'm in the middle of finals, but, you know, all of that, they did it with no pay, hours and hours of work with the community. So, yes, I think I would say yes to that.
Next question.
My name is Alexis Pauline Gums, and I live in Polly Murray's neighborhood. And I wanted to ask a question that's kind of the inverse of Dr. Savage's question of how we look at somebody as a political theorist when their work is so collaborative. And it really is more about how, I know you all have only presented a little snapshot of the people that you research, but how do we look at the ways that their work as political theorists is impacted by the other roles that they play, as you just mentioned, Meredith, about Pauli Murray being a poet and a priest and doing all this at the same time, and even following from what Julie said about feeling like there's curveballs, right, that get thrown when you feel like you have clarity, or Guzman's work as an archivist in addition to a person who ran for office and as an administrative actor. And Pauli Murray, I mean, Pauli Murray's work around, specifically, I wouldn't want folks to leave here without knowing about Pauli Murray being one of the first people to actually advocate for hormones and thinking about gender in ways that were transformative and controversial. So I guess I just wanted to give you guys a chance to explicitly talk a little bit more about how you feel like you can be accountable to the complexity of these people that you study while you're focusing on how to make a legible narrative out of their political actions.
Thank you.
May I follow on that question? It's a great question, and it's one that we've actually been talking about in our group. And in some ways, it's also a question about the relationship between intellectual history and biography, which is part of what we see here, especially when you have subjects who live very long, thankfully, rich, complicated lives, each of them, all of them, and then how do you balance loving the person, liking the person, and also then trying to tease out ideas in the way that, you know, that we're required to do when we talk about intellectual history. That's all I'm going to say in terms of a broader framing. People who want to comment on it.
Well, I guess I'll start. I mean, in some ways, it's a near impossible task to do justice to and I mean, that's how I feel, right, to Pauli Murray, and so in trying to show her as a dynamic person who is not, you know, wearing simply this kind of black feminist lawyer hat, right, which is what she's doing in the works that I'm doing, is to try to contextualize it a bit, but at the same time, it's just a difficult position to be in, to try to manage those things. So what I've been doing is reading these legal memorandums that are just as long as the title suggests, and contextualizing it with her own sort of personal autobiography and other writings that I have, you know, notations to Dorothy Kenyon about the success, and try to breathe a little bit of life into this sort of very calculated legal strategy with, you know, the lightness in some areas of her interactions with the people she's collaborating with. And so that's sort of my best middle ground, at least as of yet.
I think this is such a challenging question as well. I mean, many of these women I benefited from, and I appreciated the reference to Hedgeman's autobiographies. Chisholm wrote 2 autobiographies. Murray wrote an autobiography. In her later years, Dorothy Height did. Constance Baker Motley did. And so, you know, I've allowed those women to speak for themselves as their ideas and what they decide they wanted to make public. And when I decided to go into their political activism, you know, I did go in with a particular frame. Sure, I think one of the things I don't highlight enough in this presentation, but each of these women was really ambitious, and I think that we delude ourselves in not recognizing that. Shirley Chisholm was a strategic politician. You know, she was part of an insurgent organization in Brooklyn in the early 1950s, but she kept going to the all-male, all-white Democratic Party clubhouse because she wanted to get it all. And she works it all very effectively. She was in the debate society in college. I think that served her extremely well. She was very articulate and a wonderful speaker. As many of these women were, they're all part of they're all not only college educated, but usually graduate school educated, and oftentimes at Columbia University. And so they do have broad lives, and like I said, I have narrowed my focus to the complexity of their political activism, because the biography parts, I mean, as I've been trying to track down photographs for my book, I was just talking to the archivist at the archives in Wilberforce, where there is 100 linear feet of unprocessed material on Anna Hedgeman, and is begging for someone to write a critical biography.
I tried so hard to get to that 10 or 15 years ago, and it was unprocessed.
It is still unprocessed, unfortunately, but maybe there's some pressure that can be brought to bear to get, or resources.
They need
because
money. They need money.
They do need, and I just think that that's such a rich trove of material that needs to be tapped. So I don't have a good answer for this, except that, you know, I've tried to respect what these women felt compelled to put out there about their lives, and they were fairly cautious and protective, and for very good reasons a lot of times. Everybody had something to say about Shirley Chisholm, and when I did oral histories, the good stuff always came when they asked me to turn the tape off, because people didn't they didn't have neutral thoughts about her. They either loved her or they really took her to task. And for what she didn't do. And there was a lot of frustration that, you know, you came from our community, why aren't we more represented? And she was the only black woman in Congress. She had members of the Congress that wanted to, you know, kill her. I mean, she just really she felt like they wanted to literally cut her open to see if she was human. At one point she says that. So, like, she was up against so many things, and yet she also had to deal with the frustrations of the local community that felt very abandoned by her in some ways, even though they kept electing her with 85% of the, I mean, it's so complicated because they're like, why aren't you more of our voice? And yet they loved her still. So.
I just would like to add, because it's such a great question, and maybe this is a point for, yes, support for Black archives, because the Tuskegee University Archives, you know, has many, many incredible resources, but many, you know, the Guzman files are not exactly processed either, and but that doesn't mean you can't go in there. And you know, you got it, in order to get things processed, sometimes you have to get in there and work with them, you know, and so, you know, it's important. And I guess the thing about, I'm working on this book about Tuskegee women in general, as I said, with 2 other professors, and I do want to get more of a sense of her personality, and I am able to talk to some people who knew her. But, you know, there's so much that you don't know. But a few things maybe just that have sort of, I felt, given me a little bit of a personal insight into her maybe, is that she wrote this wonderful paper that she gave about sex education, which, you know, is kind of interesting for women in the 40s to be talking about the need for sex education, and, you know, that people needed to understand that as a normal, healthy part of life. And, you know, again, that doesn't seem so radical now, but I mean, think about birth control, not even anything knowledge about it being illegal. So I think she somehow seems to have managed to be remarkably just sort of this open-minded, clear thinker, and I don't know if that maybe, but as I said, I'm still trying to put together a lot more about her. But I'd say get in those archives, and there's things to be found.
Thank you.
Yes, we have a question.
Hi, good morning. My name is Randall Brown, and I just really thank you ladies for the work that you presented today. It definitely made some of these names no longer a whisper, but a song in my mind. Having said that, I think about some of the challenges that are going on now as far as trying to achieve things like healthcare, financial equity along party lines. It just really makes me wonder how things could have been different if there were some women in the Republican Party way back then that were trying to push some of those ideologies farther along back then. Having said that, considering some of the current talks of boycotting Celebrity Apprentice because of some of the comments that have been made regarding Obama's birthplace and things like that, can you talk a little bit more about trade with your friends? Because I've never heard about trade with your friends. So yes, that would be some of my comments and my question.
Thank you.
Well, maybe I could just say that I think it's a little bit, you know, the TCA had been working for years and years and years to educate voters and to make things happen. But it wasn't until Guzman ran and then they reacted by the gerrymander that there was this moment, I think, sometimes political action, I think, kind of crystallizes, and I think there's a little bit of a mysterious process in that. But when they came up with the trade with your friends idea, they I think suddenly that revealed to the community how, you know, for years they'd put up with so much injustice, but that act brought them together in a very profound way. So I'm not sure that's that easy to script. I think the story of the TCA, though, is if you keep working for your rights and you do that hard political work, eventually that kind of moment might crystallize. I don't know if that's a good answer, but
It's a broad question. I think that's fine.
Yeah. I forgot of myself as a historian for a moment, and I should bring back the ever important issue of context, because the question of political parties is really a question of what point in time you want to talk about the 20th century. Our political parties have transformed so completely over the course of the 20th century that the first women who were running, other than the socialists who ran in 1919, she lost because, the socialists were being red-baited at that point. Jane Bolin and Eunice Hunt and Carter ran as Republicans in the 1930s with Republican support. The New York Age got behind both of them, and they did quite well, frankly. And so there was a good reason not to back the Democrats through 48. You even had people who were tenuously connected to the Democratic Party saying, you've got the Dixiecrats in this party. I don't want to be part of the Democratic Party. And they were upset with Franklin Roosevelt for not supporting an anti-lynching piece of legislation. So political parties are complicated in this period of time, and it's only because the Democrats in New York were so powerful that it made a huge difference that they had to get in there. If they wanted to win, they were going to have to win as Democrats. But through the closest call before Bessie Buchanan won was a woman who ran. She ran as a Republican in Brooklyn. And what happened, Maud Richardson was her name. Ada Jackson was running on the American Labor Party ticket and refused to step out of the race and ended up splitting that vote. Maud Richardson lost by 77 votes against the white incumbent in 46. But because people felt strongly about their political ideas, Ada Jackson was not going to step out of the race, and she didn't think Maud Richardson had the right ideas. So it's not just the Republicans. I think the political landscape is so... the Democratic Party starts to change in 68. The Republican Party tacks hugely to the right. So it's hard to know unless we talk about what point in time we're talking about.
Yeah, and I would just echo that. In the 1960s, certainly is a period that sees a lot of party changes. And I didn't mention, I don't believe in this paper, but the legislature who's considering jury service reform actually has a bipartisan coalition. It's actually a Republican woman, Florence Dwyer, who issues the legislation that has the sex included, but people like Patsy Mink, interracial coalition of support from both sides. And the ERA up until, 1970s has bipartisan report. I mean, Richard Nixon, right, supports the ERA. And so in this period of time, it seems kind of, at least for a lot of my students, what? But in the context, the women were actually fighting not political parties. It wasn't so much that as fighting sort of ideas that both political parties in the mainstream shared.
One of the things that is coming to me as a part of this conversation, and it's something that I would encourage the panel to consider in their larger work. The civil rights movement is the nascent civil rights movement and its momentum. One of the reasons the history books give for why it got its momentum was the involvement of the federal government. And so one of the questions that's coming to me is, as these women become political activists / actors, how does that involvement of the federal government and our ideas about the state on both the local and national level translate into what, the reason why civil rights gets its push? Because in essence, I'm hearing that, as stated, access didn't mean power, but it did mean something. And what is that something? Is it a sense of presence and purpose that would result in a constant reelection of an official that we're not so sure about, but hey, you know, it's one of the family and we do need somebody there, right? Is it a signifier in that way? And then also in terms of creating a local cadre, a local community that is able to speak to its specific needs, regardless of what the larger Alabama state is doing, and to sustain itself. Because there were other black communities that tried this, but were not as successful because there were a lot of outside pressure. So one of the things I'm interested in is the neighboring counties to Macon. What's going on there that's allowing this alleged, you know, like it's almost like a metropolis, you know, kind of situation in that regard, that I think is important to kind of bring into the conversation when we look at this idea that it's the quote-unquote federal government giving the push. And lastly, in Pauli Murray's case, you know, it's a strange negotiation going on there, isn't it? You know, I mean, we keep talking about this idea of negotiation between black men and black women, between white women and white men, but now we're negotiating with the state, you know, and on different issues. And so I would really be interested in seeing how, you know, that type of concept would play out, you know, in your larger works. Dr. Savage, last word.
Thank you, Nat. I don't really, I just want to thank all the panelists and thank you all for the questions. And I hope that I know this conversation will continue, because there are other panels that are following that will pick up on some of these ideas, including the panel on education and educators tomorrow, which Sonia will be a part of. And there are a number of people in the audience who can be particularly helpful, I think, on aspects of your work. And I know that Sherry is doing some work on Chisholm, and our colleague Martha Jones, who is a legal historian, can talk to some of these questions about critical race theory, and there are a lot of people who are also doing work on black women professors, early ones, including me, and some other places. So it's been rich, it's been great. Thank you, and let the conversation continue. So thank you very much.
Sign that program and then pass it over to Professor Gebhard.
Thank you so much.
So is your case found yet?
Thank you.
No, I mean.
Because